All right, I'll get started. It's right at 5:30, but we'll probably have a couple people joining, so you might hear the little doorbell noise, but I'll let them in. So we'll get started. Thank you again. I'm not gonna lie, looking at the weather now, it doesn't look as bad as it did earlier today, but I didn't want us all to chance it, so hopefully everybody's safe and warm. And we'll get into this week and what we're gonna cover. So the reading is only one reading, Kotak chapter 3. And it's all about anthropology theory. So I'll introduce you to a few big name anthropologists today. And you do have online review questions and a group activity, which is basically on your own, watch a 7-minute video. Technically, the link is for a 30-minute video, but you just watch the first 7 minutes. You can watch the whole thing if you want, but I only require the first 7 minutes. And then just kind of have a discussion about one of the terms that Margaret Mead uses in the interview, which is an old interview. It's from 1959. So it's a little outdated. We got some outdated terms. I'm making a note to myself, or I'll forget to do something. So let me get the slide going for you. Just in case you have any, ask me to interview, writing my note. Just in case you have any connection issues, um, just heard like a thump. Just in case you have any connection issues, I am recording this lesson, so I will have a recording of it just in case you have to exit for any reason. So looking at some key terms. Participant observation. When we're talking anthropology, one of the ways cultural anthropologists really conduct their research is through participant observation, meaning we participate as well as observe, which sounds kind of obvious. But like journalists will go and observe a situation and report back. Anthropologists do the observing and the reporting, but we also participate when possible. Sometimes there are events that are closed to outsiders. Maybe a religious service that if you're not indoctrinated into the faith, you don't get to participate in. That's okay. We're not, there to break it up and, insist we participate. But when it's allowed, we participate in the goings-ons and the daily activities. You may have heard of the term culture shock before. This is feeling of disorientation when confronted with cultural differences. So it can be as drastic as traveling to a new country, not knowing the language, not knowing the customs, the food is different, the bathrooms are different, and you get that overwhelming feeling of culture shock where you're just feeling like everything is different. And sometimes it can feel like everything is wrong, but really it's just different. It can also be as minor as, let's say, okay, I did this when I went to grad school in Kalamazoo. I moved from Grand Rapids to Kalamazoo, still within Michigan. We still had Myers. The difference is when I went to the Kalamazoo Meijer, the layout was different. Of course, not every Meijer is a mirror image of each other, but I remember having a moment of like, oh, I had laid out my grocery list in my head to follow a certain path, and now I have to readjust. Not as jarring as something being in a new language, but still a moment of culture shock of, oh, things are done a little differently here. I need to adjust myself. And we also take tons and tons of field notes. These are notes about customs, first impressions, names, and locations. There's a little quote there from Bronislaw Malinowski, which we'll talk about him a little bit more today. And he's talking about that basically we should look at aspects that are so fundamental they're taken for granted. So, yes, our field notes are going to be writing down names of people and some of our first impressions. We're also going to be writing down simple things like how they prepare a meal, who prepares the meal, when they eat, who is invited, who eats first, who's served first, little things like that that can tell us bigger clues about their culture. Now, because we are products of our own culture, 100% impartial attitude is not guaranteed. Basically, we need to recognize that we are a little culture bound, meaning we have our expectations because of how we were raised. It's also why it's important to do interviews in the native language if possible. Sometimes it's not possible. When I was looking at doing research in southern India, I would have needed to learn how to speak Tamil, one of the, in fact, I think the oldest spoken language out there right now. The problem is now, 10 years later, Duolingo does have a Tamil language, but they didn't at the time. And the university I was at, while a big university, still didn't teach it. And so my advisor was kind of planning on sending me there for maybe a good 3 months before I actually conducted interviews to just force me to learn the language. It would have been hard, but possible. The reason why we'd prefer to do the interview in the interviewee's native language is because things can get lost in translation. If you speak more than one language, or if you've even studied another language in school, you know that sometimes you can't translate something word for word, or sometimes there's an expression that just doesn't translate well. Some great examples on the slide. I don't know what that dish is. It looks like shrimp or prawns, but they translated it in like Google Translate and it came out as just spicy grandma, which makes me chuckle. My real world example, when I studied the French language, I'm not fluent, but I studied it for a little bit. And one of the professors I had was French. And obviously, she lived in the States. She'd lived here for a while, but she had us, we were learning future tense. So, how to say, I'm looking forward to something or something's going to happen in the future. And so, she wanted us to write a journal entry about the next weekend. And that way, we'd all write about what we were going to do that weekend. So, we turn in our little journal entries, and she hands them back and says to us, I'm so sorry. I did not foresee this issue. I should have warned you about a phrase some of you used in your journal. What we had tried to translate was, I am excited, which a lot of us used either a little translator dictionary or Google Translate to figure out how to say, I am excited, which in French is Je suis excité. Sounds perfect. I am excited. Boom, got it. Nailed it. The problem is, in French slang, at least at the time, I don't know if it still is, but at the time, je suis excité was slang for I'm horny. And we can all have a good laugh at it now, but our poor teacher had to read all of these journal entries where basically we were saying in French, I'm horny to go to the movies, or I'm horny to go to the mall. And we, like I said, we had a good laugh about it, but it stuck with me of like, yeah, sometimes things, even if it does literally translate well, it may not loosely translate. Like it may have a slang version that we need to be cautious of. Now, something we do a lot in cultural anthropology is interviews. We conduct a lot of interviews. An interview schedule is less about the time we do in the interview and more about a list of questions that we want to be sure to ask. I'll get into it, but we do have to have those questions approved. And we have to ask demographic questions like sex, age, things like that, race. Then we might get into family makeup. If this is a new culture we're studying, we want to know Okay, what does your family look like? What does the average family look like? Who lives in the home? Who takes care of who? Who cooks? Who cleans? Who does outside duties? Things like that. And that ties into gendered division in labor. Now, if we sit down with anybody and say, hey, what's the gendered division of labor in your household? A lot of people don't break it down like that. But what you can do is you can ask each home who does what job. And then when you've interviewed, say, 10 families, you can look for similarities. Maybe in 8 out of 10 families, all men do the dishes. And you can say, oh, that might be a little gendered division of labor going on there. We also like to do questionnaires. Kotak mentions a questionnaire as kind of something sociologists do, and they do, but anthropologists do as well. This is also sometimes referred to as just a survey. But basically, it's a list of questions that rather than sit down across from someone and have a conversation like an interview, we can print out the questions or mail them to them and say, hey, fill this out in your free time and mail it back to me, email it back to me. And there are pros and cons to both. So, a pro of an interview is you're going to get more information than you originally bargained for. You sit down before the interview and you write out all the questions you want to ask. But once you conduct the interview, it's supposed to be more like a conversation. And so think of a conversation you have. Both parties participate. So, yes, they're going to get to know a little bit about me as the interviewer as well. It's not my time to shine, but I'm also not going to be closed off. And I get more information because I might ask a question that on a survey or a questionnaire, you just answer strictly the question asked. So let's say with my own interviews, when I asked, what's a safety concern you have over the road for the truck drivers, if you remember? And if I ask them in a survey and they fill it out on their own, they might just give me a stock answer that I got a lot of other drivers. That's a safety concern on the road. And I'm like, yeah, that's all of us are kind of concerned about other drivers. If I had only done it in a survey, that might have been the only answer I got. But because I was doing interviews and somebody said, oh, my biggest safety concern is other drivers, I would be able to steer it a little bit and say, oh, good point. I guess we're all kind of concerned about that. Other than other drivers, what's something as a truck driver specifically a safety concern you face? I can dig a little deeper. I can ask follow-up questions. The con of an interview is it takes a long time. You're supposed to have at least an hour, maybe two, depends on the person, to sit down and talk. Plus, once you're done with the interview, you have to transcribe the entire thing. You have to type up every single thing that happened in the interview, and that is very time consuming. A pro of a questionnaire is you can get the same questions answered by a lot more people in a shorter amount of time than an interview. So an interview, like I said, couple of hours for one person. A questionnaire, I could mail out the questionnaire to 100 people, and yeah, I'm not going to get any further info from them, but I am going to get the answers to my questions from 100 people instead of, say, 10. But, the con, like I said, is they're only going to answer the questions you asked versus in an interview, you can usually get a little bit more information. I mentioned that we have to have our questions pre-approved. If you do any kind of social science, I can't speak for all the hard sciences, but the social sciences, if you do any kind of academic research, it has to be pre-approved through the IRB or the Internal Review Board. Basically, it's made up of people who have been in the field for many, many years, and they review all of your paperwork. So when I did my research, they had to approve my game plan, my research proposal. They had to approve any of the documents I had my interviewees sign. One of the things was that I promised to hide their identity. I promised to change their name, and I promised to keep all of my data locked up, which was kind of a pain in the butt, but I did it. And they had to sign off on, yes, I agree to participate. The pre-approved core questions, we get pre-approval to make sure that we're not being invasive. So even if you're not planning to be invasive, you can accidentally be. So my concern was talking about truckers and safety issues. So I originally wanted to know if anyone had had something really bad happen. And so I wanted to ask, have you witnessed any violence or sexual assault? It wasn't a bad question, but realistically, and I'm thankful that they called me out on it because I was much younger, they warned me that that could be very triggering to somebody who has experienced it firsthand. And they're right, that could be incredibly triggering. And my goal was not to, upset people or to make them relive something horrible. My goal was to just figure out how safe it is out there on the road. So instead, what we did was kind of reframe the question where I could say, tell me about a time where you felt your safety was at risk. And then it was up to them. They could just tell me about, oh, one time somebody cut me off in traffic and I thought I was going to rear end them and that was scary. Or realistically, one of them told me about witnessing human trafficking. Now, thankfully, because I was going to hide her name and everything, she could feel comfortable telling me that, knowing that I wasn't going to publish, like, this is so and so, and this is what she witnessed on this highway. Nope, all of that was hidden. I could talk about what she witnessed, but not name names or locations. The goal of getting this pre-approved is also to help me as the interviewer. It helps me direct the interviews without confining the flow. Like I said, they're supposed to be like a conversation. So I may have mentioned this before. I think my favorite interaction was a little old lady. She was retired from truck driving many, many years. And I came over to her senior living apartment and we had coffee and talked for a couple of hours. And she got distracted talking about things that had nothing to do with my interview. And did that kind of make the interview last longer? Yeah. Was it more to transcribe? Yes. But she was fun. And where I say keep it like a conversation is, yeah, I kept us on task, but I let her wander a little bit. She picked up a magazine at one point and pointed out Bradley Cooper and told me this was like 10, 15 years ago, how handsome he was and how dreamy Bradley Cooper was. And yeah, did that have anything to do with being a truck driver? No. But if I cut her off and said, yeah, 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 but anyways, back to trucking, she probably wouldn't want to talk to me much more because then the conversation would feel more analytical and less like two friends talking. So I let her gush about Bradley Cooper for a couple minutes and said, yeah, that's a handsome man. And then I kind of steered us back into trucking. So that's what I mean by letting it be a conversation, but still, keeping you on task. Now, if we're looking at a new culture specifically, we may want to do a family tree or a genealogical method. This is the use of diagrams and symbols to record kin connections or your family tree. Now, I may bring this up more in a few weeks when we talk about kinship and family. Excuse me. And I have a couple examples on the next slide, but basically, we will sit down with one person and say, okay, tell me all of your family members. And we list them all out and what their names are, what their title are. Like, do you call them grandma? Do you call them Aunt Shirley? Something like that. And then we draw it out and try to figure out if this is the norm for this culture or if families look a little different. When you're setting out with a new community, be it a village somewhere or a group of truckers, you need to find a key cultural consultant. They are also called gatekeepers, and very frequently they are elders in the community. They're pretty much experts on a particular aspect of local life. So, if this is a small village, you find great grandma who's been around for 98 years, and you talk to her and you get her life history. Life history is a personal portrait of someone's life in a culture. Now, if this is, let's say, 95-year-old great grandma, I don't know how old I made her originally, it's going to be a long life history. But in getting 95 years of life, you're getting real firsthand experiences of major historical events, major natural disasters, multiple births, deaths, weddings, heck, divorces. You're gonna hear it all. And if she's anything like, I am going to be a little cavalier, my neighbor, bless her heart, she is, I think, around 80. She knows everybody's business. Everybody's business. She knows my schedule. And in fact, if I deviate from my schedule, the next time I see her, she will be like, "Where did you go Tuesday afternoon?" And I'm like, "Dang, I went to Meyer." Um, she knows everybody's business, which, yeah, sounds a little busybody, but if it's you trying to get to know everybody's business, that's a great person to talk to. When I did truck driving research, my key cultural consultant was my own aunt. She had been a truck driver for 15, 20 years. She had since been retired a few years, but because she'd done it for a while, and because I was already comfortable with her, she was the first person I talked to. And I basically grilled her, where she would tell me a story about her trucking days, and I would be allowed to interrupt her and say, "Hey, what does that word mean? I don't know what that word is." And then she'd say, "Oh, it's blah, blah, blah." Like my favorite, she casually, and this is left over from train cargo lingo, but she was casually talking about a friend of hers who drove a reefer, reefer. And I sat there for a second and I thought, the only reefer I have ever heard of is marijuana. So I interrupted her and I said, "I'm so sorry. What's a reefer?" And she kind of chuckled and she said, "Oh, sorry, it's a refrigerated truck." And there I thought, okay, that makes sense. Refrigerator, reefer. But we had a good laugh when I said, "Yeah, the only other reefer I was thinking of." And she kind of chuckled and goes, "Oh, yeah, not that kind." I'm like, just checking. But talking to her and getting to know all of this lingo helped me then interview other truckers so that if they say something like, "Yeah, I used to drive a reefer," I don't have to look confused or quickly Google it. I can already know, "Oh, I already talked to my aunt. I already know what that is." So they're really kind of your guides to the community. These are some visual examples you don't have to memorize. We have an Iroquois kinship chart on the top, and then the one on the bottom, it's covered a little bit by all my stuff, but the one at the bottom is basically like many Americans. You start with ego in the center, the black triangle. As long as you have a key, like on the top one, that tells us what symbol means what, you can use whatever symbols you want. However, most anthropologists use a triangle for men and a circle for women. Nowadays, excuse me, if you have like non-binary individuals, excuse me again, I had the hiccups earlier and I hope they're not back. Anyways, if you have non-binary individuals, you can kind of create your own symbol. It can be a square, a star, whatever. As long as you tell us what it means in your little key. And then a very pretty example, which I'll talk about again because they're pretty, are totem poles. We see those within the Pacific Northwest tribes of North America. So, like British Columbia, parts of Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and I think parts of Northern California. Basically, each family or clan is represented by a different animal. And so to represent your lineage, you put them all on a pole, and they're beautiful, giant pieces of art. Now, looking at ethnography strategies, um, we are problem oriented. When we are performing ethnography, which is basically cultural research and like, I always think of it as like collecting stories. We have to focus our research on one or two issues. Even if I'm looking at such a simple community like truck drivers, they're facing more than one issue. They're facing safety issues. They're also facing union issues. They're facing job wage issues. They're facing physical issues. Like there's a lot of problems. And to try and talk about all of them would take years. So instead, we need to pick one or maybe two to focus on. Ideally, we like to perform longitudinal research, which basically just means long-term study. Nowadays, it's usually based on repeated visits to the same area. Historically, like Bronislaw Malinowski, um, we used to do research by traveling to the other part of the world and living there for 1 to 2 years. Now, the reason for that is if you're there for at least a year, you're going to experience every weather pattern, you're going to experience every holiday, you're probably going to experience a birth and a death and a wedding. And these are really big cultural events. So it helps you kind of cement your understanding of the people. But nowadays, we have limitations to that. It used to be that if you wanted to travel like Bronislaw Malinowski again, he went from Poland in Europe to the Trobriand Islands down in the South Seas, like the Pacific Islands areas. And that's a really long journey. And he did this in the early 1900s. So he would have traveled mostly by trains and boats. It's going to take him a long time and be very expensive to get there. So once he gets there, he's going to stay put for as long as he can. Nowadays, it's at least cheaper. It's not free, but it's cheaper to travel across the world and it's faster. So we can go for shorter time. A lot of anthropologists are also academics, so that also limits us. If you teach during the school year, that leaves only the summer to go do your research unless you take a sabbatical. So sometimes now, rather than doing a year or two living with them, we do 3 to 6 months at a time and then come back for another visit. And oftentimes we'll conduct team research. So this looks like field schools. In undergrad and graduate schools, if you are majoring in anthropology, you are required to do a field school. This is for 4-year universities and up. This is not like a shameless plug to try to get you to transfer to Grand Valley, but Grand Valley is one of the closest 4-year universities that has an anthropology degree program. And they do field schools every summer. They do some international, but then every other summer they kind of alternate. So one summer they will do an on-campus archaeological field school, and then the next summer they do an on-campus ethnography field school. So that way, if you're doing the hard science route, like physical anthropology and archaeology, you get a turn. And if you're doing the social science route, like cultural anthropology and linguistics, you have a turn. It's a great way for students to kind of test the waters, especially if we're talking undergrad. It's a great way for you to say, do I want to continue this on into grad school? Do I want to make this my career? Because especially with like archaeology field school, you're outside in the elements. Some of us, myself included, I don't do that great in the elements. I can handle it for a little bit, but for my 40-hour-a-week job, I don't know. That's why I'm more in the cultural anthropology role. But it's a great way for you to kind of test the waters. And it's a great way for the person leading it to conduct a wider range of research without breaking the bank. Basically, the person leading it gets free labor, and the people doing the labor get college credits. So it's win-win for everybody. I guess it would be win-win if everybody got paid, but that's usually not how they operate. I already mentioned that 100% objectivity is not guaranteed. We have biases that we carry with us. Sometimes they are covert, meaning we don't even know about them. We don't realize we have these biases. Objectivity is when you are not influenced by personal feelings or opinions in considering and representing facts. We try to be objective, but realistically, we know we're humans. We know we're going to be faced with things that might make us say, "Ooh, I don't like that," or "Ooh, that makes me uncomfortable." But as I've kind of mentioned before, we need to kind of test the waters of, is this so bad that it's hurting people, or is this just something that I personally don't like? So I should have edited this slide. I'm going to kind of quickly go over the first two because they're not as important as the last two. A sample is when you take a smaller study group chosen to represent a larger population. So, for example, if I wanted to do a study on college students, and there's no way I could interview all college students even in Michigan. There's no way. They'd all graduate before I got to them. Um, I couldn't even personally, by myself, interview all Muskegon Community College students. There's way too many of you. But I could interview my class and say, well, I interviewed these 20 so people, and from their answers, I can extrapolate what the larger population would look like. Yeah, ideally, it would be better to talk to everyone. But like I said, that's not always possible. And variables are just attributes that differ from one person or case to the next. So even saying two people can go through the same life event, but may have very different experiences around it, which is why we try to interview as many people as possible. Now, I mentioned that the last two are the more important ones because a complex society versus small scale, excuse me, I'll use those terms a lot. And in fact, when it comes time for your research paper, which I'll have to get to you next week, um, it won't be due until April, but I'll get to you next week. Uh, I didn't want to panic anyone. It's about a small scale society. So the difference is literally size and obviously complexity. A complex society is a large and populous society with social stratification and central governments. Versus a small scale society is anywhere from a few dozen to several thousand people in population with less complex government. So, where I say like complexity of government, if I live in a small scale society of maybe even 1,000 people, and we have a chief, the chief is in charge. Now, the chief may have a little hierarchy, but realistically, if I wanted to talk to the chief about my problems, I could. I could have access to him. And he would actually have the authority to take care of my problems. Versus here in Michigan, we're part of a very complex government. So let's say me and my neighbor are beefing about property lines, and I want to put up a fence, and we're arguing over where the fence should go. I can't go to the President of the United States with that issue. I, one, don't even have access to him. And two, this is not a dig on the president, any of the presidents wouldn't really know what to do. They would have to kind of redirect me and say, like, whoa, that's way beneath me. Like, talk to your governor, talk to your mayor, go way down the line. So I have to go up the hierarchy. I would probably have to talk to, I've never looked into this, but I'm assuming like a city planner or somebody way lower in government than the US president. And like I said, even if I wanted to talk to our governor, I don't know that I'd get through to her. And similarly, she would also tell me, like, this is way beneath what I deal with. Like, you need to talk to somebody else. So it really comes down to how many people are in the society and how complex their government is. Now, I'm about to start introducing some people to you. This slide is just to kind of give you the heads up of what I want you to focus on. Yes, obviously, I want you to pay attention to them, and I would love you to memorize all of it. But realistically, you don't need to memorize their date of birth and death. I will include that more to kind of give you an idea of where they land historically, if we're looking at a timeline. So you know who existed at the same time, who came first, things like that. Focus on the person's name, even if you only memorize their last name, their contributions to anthropology, like any main theory they used, and the area of the world or peoples they worked with. So that's what I want you to really focus on. Their name, what they contributed to anthropology or why they're important, and who they worked with. So I'll introduce you to a few people. You will notice that the majority of them are white men, with a few ladies sprinkled in. These are the really, really big, like, founding people of anthropology. Nowadays, thankfully, anthropology is way more diverse. So here's the first guy. This is Clyde Kluckholm, and I don't go in chronological order, which is why I include their timeline next to them. He was an American anthropologist, lived from 1905 to 1960. He worked with the Dene or Navajo people. Technically, the Navajo people have two names. Most of us know them as Navajo, which is why they still keep that name. But historically, way before Europeans got here, they would call themselves the Dene. So it's kind of more like Dene, but I'm sure I'm butchering it a little bit because I don't speak the language. But just so you know why I have two different names there. Kluckhohn really wanted us to focus on a public service role. He thought we should be very sensitive of cultural issues, meaning we should work with indigenous communities rather than against them, and we should try to help them. He also gave us, or helped us, kind of get the informed consent. So when I did research, all of my interviewees, before I was allowed to interview them, had to read and sign an informed consent form. Basically, it's the agreement to participate in the research. What I had to put into my form is I basically had to detail who I was, where I got my funding, what I was looking for, what I was going to do with my research, meaning where I was going to publish it, and if I planned on using it further down the line. And I had to detail all of that. You might think some of it is a little overkill, but if you think of it in funding, this is a very silly analogy. But let's say I was going to do that research on college students, and I come up to you and I say, "Hey, I'm doing research on college students. I'm going to ask a few questions. Do you want to participate?" And you say, "Sure. Can I look at that informed consent form?" And I say, "Okay," and hand it over. And you look at it, and it says funding. All funding provided from the Association to Ruin College Students' Lives. You rightfully might not want to participate in that research. You might now second guess, like, wait a minute, I don't know if you really have my best interest in mind. So that's why we tell people where we get our funding from. It's not to brag, it's to say, like, this is who I'm affiliated with, this is who I'm reporting to. And that way we can know if it's like a big company that we have, we don't like or something like that. We do have a code of ethics. It is put forth in the American Anthropological Association, or the AAA. This was founded in 1902 by Papa Franz Boas. I'll introduce him in a couple slides, but he is the father of American anthropology. He is basically the one that organized our anthropology in having the four subfields of archaeology, physical anthropology, linguistics, and cultural. The AAA has an annual conference, usually in November, sometimes December, and they usually alternate between somewhere in the United States and somewhere else. It makes sense to mostly be in the United States because it is the American Anthropological Association, but they do kind of branch out and sometimes go other places in the world. If you ever want to see a whole bunch of nerds in one place, go to an academic conference. We're all buzzing about, very excited. They have a code of ethics, two of them here. You don't have to memorize the code of ethics, so don't panic on that. But the first one is anthropologists should inform all parties affected by their research about its nature, goals, procedures, potential impacts, and sources of funding, and obtain their consent based on the information provided, which is a lengthy way of saying get that informed consent. And then the last is that researchers should establish proper relationships with the countries and communities where they work. Meaning, if we are going into a new country, we need to abide by their rules and customs. Even if it's not necessarily a like a law, if it's the custom, we need to follow it. So, for example, if I were to do travels and research in the Middle East, there are a few countries that legally require I, as a woman, to be fully covered. There are some other countries where it's not legally required, but it's customary to wear a head covering. Even though I am not Muslim and I am not Middle Eastern or Arab, I would still participate in that. It wouldn't count as cultural appropriation. It counts more as kind of blending in and being respectful. If they view my uncovered hair as deeply disrespectful, me personally, what good is it going to do to argue with them and be like, no, let me have, I'm just going to wear the head covering because it's more respectful. And if I'm there not as a tourist, but rather to kind of ask favors of them to participate in my research, then I want to be as respectful as possible. Now, I bring that up because back post 9/11, the AAA deemed the study of terrorism of paramount importance. And we, not all of us, but some anthropologists, basically worked closely with the US government. One of those was in Project Minerva in 2008. There, we used scholars to translate original documents captured in Iraq. I kept that I kept that wording from the book because I think captured documents is one of my favorite ways of saying stolen. I'm not going to get into whether or not we should have stolen them, but we could have just said stolen. We looked at political shifts in China, and we used academic research to explain the resurgence of the Taliban in Afghanistan. We also participated in the Human Terrain System. This was a project that went from 2007 to 2014, and the Pentagon sent anthropologists and other social scientists embedded in military teams in Iraq and Afghanistan. It technically violates our code of ethics because if we are supposed to be on good terms with the countries we're going into, and if we're supposed to be following their rules, going embedded in a military team where we're not getting informed consent, we're not identifying ourselves until we're already there, and we're kind of barging in, technically breaks our code of ethics. Now, the good news is, I'm not going to make you argue on whether or not you think that was an appropriate reason to break the ethics. That's up to you to decide. But it does technically break our code of ethics. Looking at anthropological theory over time. So, a theory, when we're in science, is a supposition or a system of ideas intended to explain something, especially one based on general principles independent of the thing to be explained. We're going to go over a lot of theoretical perspectives. This is less about if you or I say, I have a theory about this. Like maybe you have a theory about who's going to win the reality show you're watching, or I have a theory about a conspiracy theory. We hear about those all the time. That's just kind of an idea I have. This is kind of an organization of general principles that can explain how culture forms or how culture is transferred. The reason why we go over a few of these big names and a few of these big theories is think of it like kinship and genealogy. We're looking at the anthropology family tree. What anthropologists came before us? And some of them I will tell you about and say, yeah, we don't really do that anymore, or that's been disproven, or something like that. I'm not just focusing on when we've been wrong, but rather to say that this is how we've grown and how, like I said, we've become a much more diverse discipline than we originally started out. So this is Henry Louis Morgan. He lived from 1818 to 1881. He was a Victorian gentleman, and a term I will use, he was a product of his time. Sometimes I hear people in everyday language refer to someone as a product of their time, kind of as a way to dismiss their racism or dismiss their sexism, and kind of make it like, oh, it's no big deal. He's just a product of his time. That is not how I use it, but rather to say, he was a Victorian man. So there were some things he was doing that in the 1800s was considered very, very progressive. Nowadays, it may not be. So, for example, he was a lawyer by trade, and he performed the first ethnography kind of by chance. He basically just thought the Seneca and Iroquois people, Native Americans, he thought they were neat, and they were pretty cool. They still are. He basically just liked them and thought their culture was really beautiful and interesting. And so he kind of hung out with them and learned all about them and took notes. He helped popularize the sport of lacrosse. And where it was very progressive is he advocated for them as a lawyer. So anytime that those people needed legal representation, Morgan would basically say, I got you. Like, don't hire a different lawyer. I'm a lawyer. I will represent you in court. And kind of was their champion in that sense. So, in that sense, for the 1800s, that was very advanced and very progressive. Where he was a bit outdated is he thought that Native Americans were living fossils. Now, to explain his reasoning, he knew that if we look back at human history, all of us at one point were living as foragers or hunters and gatherers and fishers. And that eventually, like Europeans, picked up agriculture and then industrialization and were living as modern Victorians. Because he lived in a city and as a modern Victorian, and the Native Americans were living as foragers, he thought, well, they're basically less evolved than us. They're basically a glimpse in the past. And in some instances, I see where he's getting at. Yes, we can look at modern foragers, hunter-gatherers, and learn about our collective past, but it does not mean that they are less evolved than the rest of us. It does not mean that they will all eventually abandon hunter-gathering and pick up industrialization. There are in 2026 many, many groups of people still living as foragers. There are many groups still living as agriculturalists. Not everybody is living like we are in cities in the US or in Europe. So that's where he was a little outdated. You may have seen this image or something similar. It's usually called like the March of Man or the Evolution of Man. In theory, it's a beautiful visual image, but where it's problematic is the main thing is it makes it seem as though we evolved from chimpanzees because you have a modern chimpanzee on the far left, and then you have other human species leading to, on the right, modern Homo sapiens. We don't get heavy into evolution in this class, but it's good to know that we did not evolve from modern chimpanzees. An argument I hear against evolution is, well, if we evolved from apes, why are there apes? And that's honestly not a bad argument because it's a faulty understanding of what we're saying evolution is. We didn't evolve from modern apes. Rather, us and modern apes have common ancestors. Now, it may have been a very, very long time ago, but we still share common ancestors, which is why I will often refer to modern apes as more of our cousins than they are our fathers. So that's where this image gets it wrong. I would like to update it. I'm just not that good of an artist. Here's a more modern example where it shows us evolving to be computer workers. This image and what Henry Louis Morgan kind of perpetuated is called unilinear evolutionism. It's the idea of a single line or path of cultural development. Many of these anthropologists believed that every single society started out as savagery. Now, thankfully, we don't refer to groups of people as savages anymore, but that used to be a much more common term, which you will notice in the interview the little activity you do with the interview video online. They thought everybody started out as savage, then they went to barbarism, and lastly to civilization. So if that were the case, then yes, we could say people living as foragers are less culturally evolved. But they're not. They're just as far advanced as the rest of us. It's just that they're doing a different way of life. So it's good to know that unilinear evolutionism is not accurate. And if you do want to explore human evolution, we'll get into it culturally, but as you like human physical evolution, definitely recommend Anthropology 105. That is a shameless plug. For physical anthropology and archaeology, we get way more in depth with evolution. So if it is something that interests you, I'm sorry that I'm like, oh, we're not going to get super heavy into it, but we do in another class and it's really interesting. Well, I'm biased. There's a bias I have. I think it's interesting. So this is another guy, Sir Edward B. Tyler. Another Victorian man, lived from 1832 to 1970. I believe he was British, and he used personal experience rather than education. Notably, he was the first professor of anthropology at Oxford University. He thought we followed a religious unilinear evolution. Now, there are three words in this last bullet point that you may not know. You will know them in more detail when we talk about religion in a few weeks. But this is, to very briefly explain, animism is belief in like nature spirits and everything having a spirit. Polytheism is the belief in more than one god, and monotheism is the belief in one god. Important to know for this explanation, but you don't have to memorize yet. Give yourself time. Um, he thought every single society followed the exact same unilinear evolutionism, and they went from animism to then polytheism, then to monotheism, and lastly to science. Now, have some societies followed that exact same path? Yes. And have some people followed that exact same path? Yes. But for the most part, religion is not going anywhere. Um, Nowadays, it's 2026. There are tons of animists out there. There are tons of polytheists. There are tons of monotheists. And there are tons of scientific atheists. What he also doesn't account for is there are tons of religious scientists. You do not have to abandon one to really go into the other. You can be both religious or spiritual and scientific. You may have a little more of a balance than somebody that completely only goes to one, but you can do both. And we can see, like I said, that even today, in our country, there are some atheists that are purely science driven, and there are a lot of people that are completely anti-science. It doesn't mean eventually they're going to abandon their faith. So it just kind of, we were missing the track a little bit. We were kind of trying to think, okay, well, this is the way that we went, so we must assume everybody else follows the same path. And thankfully, through a lot of research, we collectively figured out that's not always the case. Historical particularism is the idea that histories are not comparable step by step, and that diverse paths can lead to the same cultural result. Franz Boas, who I've mentioned and you'll see on the next slide, he argued that the history of a particular culture lay in the study of its individual traits unfolding in a limited geographic region. Basically, looking at diffusion, and that cultures share things, and sometimes they have independent invention. When we talked about Ancient Aliens, I said it kind of frustrates me that that show tries to say that pyramids were popping up around the world because aliens were influencing us. And while that is really a neat theory, it doesn't really hold a lot of water. And realistically, the reason why we see pyramids in various different parts of the world is because pyramids are one of the strongest structures you can build, one of the strongest shapes. It doesn't tip over as easy as other shapes, and it's got a wider bottom for more stability. So basically, what happened is most likely independent from each other, various communities like ancient Egypt and ancient Mexico, they all around the same, maybe not the same time, but they all kind of discovered, hey, if we want to build a really big monument and we start with a big base and then make it smaller towards the top, we can build these things pretty big and they're going to be um pretty strong and sturdy. And yeah, don't feel bad if you fell for the ancient aliens thing. It's a really cool theory. I think I said I would watch a movie or a TV series about it. It sounds awesome. But the reason why anthropologists get kind of mad about the ancient aliens theory is it's it's dismissing the actual ingenuity and intelligence of ancient peoples. They were smart enough to come up with this on their own. They didn't have to have an alien come teach them. So there's good old Papa Franz, Franz Boas. He lived from 1858 to 1942. As I mentioned, he is the one that created the American four subfield approach to anthropology. If you go into England or the UK, archaeology will be housed with the history department. One of the main things that Boas argued about is that many of the other anthropologists of the time in the late 1800s, I may have already mentioned this. Realistically, the beginnings of anthropology were pretty racist. And I say that not as a gotcha, but rather to say, I think hiding that doesn't do us any good. We need to understand that it was racist at the beginning. It was all white men, and they wanted to use the study of evolution to prove that white people were genetically and evolutionarily superior. Now, thankfully, what they ended up proving was, I almost said the opposite, not necessarily the opposite, but what they ended up proving instead was that we're all the same species and no race is more or less evolved than anybody else, and that we're all equally intelligent. So he was a big arguer. He said biology or race did not determine cultural achievements, basically arguing against unilinear evolutionism, saying that it wasn't up to the individual's race to say how smart they were, but rather it was up to their culture and to the opportunities they had. So that is why we also call him Papa Franz, because he's the father of American anthropology. And there's a close-up of Bronislaw Malinowski. He was tied predominantly to functionalism. It's an approach that focuses on the role of sociocultural practices in social systems. He lived just around the same time as Franz Boas, from 1884 to 1942. He looked at all customs and institutions in society are interrelated, meaning if you change one, you end up changing more with like a ripple effect. And it really does kind of, I'm trying to think of a good example, and my brain is completely blanking. But if we change one thing, look at like music. If we have a new music scene, um, what comes with it is language changes. So when rap and hip hop were really coming on the scene, late 70s into the 80s, we ended up then adopting new lingo. I'm thinking of a more modern example. Look at the popularity in the US of K-pop. First of all, we have the term K-pop to mean Korean pop, as opposed to J-pop. Um, and we come up with different terms. I'm not big in the K-pop scene, but I know there are some terms that are really unique to that scene. And that can have then lasting effects, maybe on fashion, on movies. Look at K-pop Demon Hunters, how popular that was. And yeah, it has lasting effects and ripple effects. He also focused on needs functionalism. So looking at that there are some universal biological needs: food, water, shelter, sex. Now, in no way am I saying on the individual level we absolutely need sexual intercourse to survive, but rather on the species level. if our species wants to survive, then yes, we do need to be reproducing and having more babies. Um, but it also kind of brings up a good example. I'm trying to think if it's on. No, it's not. I'm jumping ahead of myself. So I may get into this in another week, but think of it like we have universal basic needs that if they're not met, we can't focus on anything else. So if our focus is on survival, like finding food, and we're living in a destitute food desert with no food, we're not going to be thinking about religion, or we're not going to be thinking about physics, or we're not going to be thinking about making art as much because we're going to be focused on finding food. We need to take care of our biological needs before we can get into anything else. This guy is Alfred Reginald Radcliffe Brown. Long name. He lived from 1881 to 1955. I'm going to crap talk him a little bit. He has some other great stuff. But where I don't like him is he dismissed oral histories. Basically, he said if your history isn't written down, it doesn't count. And unfortunately, for a lot of indigenous communities, many of them historically did not have a written language. Now, it wasn't that it wasn't that he fully didn't believe them. He thought oral traditions were easier to edit. So if you've ever, this is an old game. If you've ever played the game Telephone, where you get people in a line and the person on one end comes up with a phrase like, the crow flies at midnight, and they whisper it to the person next to them, and then that person whispers it to the person next to them, and down the line. What ends up happening is the more people you have, the more distorted the message gets. And so it starts at the crow flies at midnight, and by you time you get through 20 people, it's changed to the last person thinking the message is the cow flies over the moon. And like you can see there's some similarities, but you're like, no, it was crow, not cow. That's what he was thinking of. That if we pass down traditions only by word of mouth, they can be changed. But I would argue we are still changing written histories and traditions as well. A great example of that is the Bible. Think of, if you are Christian, how many different variations of the Bible there are out there. Tons. And they're all different translations, and they all have to do with who is doing the translating, the era they're translating, their gender, their nationality. And that can change the meaning of the same book. Now, I'm going to give you permission to ignore the last two terms on the slide. I'm sorry if you already wrote them down. They're not super important. I need to take them off. Yeah, they're interesting. I'm not trying to be like they're stupid, but I'd rather just focus on this next little part. So, I have an example of what is lost when we focus on written history only. If you have ever seen the Easter Island heads, they are also called the moai on Easter Island, and they look like this. Most of them are buried up to the shoulder or the chin. And for years, anthropologists wanted to figure out what these were and how they got there and how big they were. So they started excavating them. And a lot of them are really big. You can see on the left that has a whole body. There's 4 or 5 guys climbing around on it. Now, the Rapa Nui people of Easter Island do not have a written history. And so, what the anthropologists noticed is these things are massive, and the rocks they're carved out of weren't found on this side of the island. They were found on the other side of the island, which means they were carved and then transported across an entire island. And they wanted to know how. So they asked the Rapa Nui people, well, how did your ancestors move these? And they all said the same thing. Oh, they walked. And at first, some of the anthropologists thought, oh, it's just a legend. Maybe they have a myth that these things came alive and walked across the island, and they kind of brushed it off. That is until, hopefully, you can hear this, but I'll be honest, the volume is not the most important part. They made a replica and tested walking it.
Who said I could walk?
So, yeah, it's from a larger, I'm so sorry, my brain just completely blanked. It's called a documentary, Stephanie. It's from a larger documentary about it that's pretty interesting, through Nova or National Geographic. So we don't want to discount oral traditions just because they're not written down. Now, getting into configurationalism, this is Ruth Benedict, and she gave us patterns of culture, looking at diffusion of traits, relying on the adaptability of the trait. So, for example, in order for something to be picked up by more than one culture, it has to be adaptable. Um, think of it this way. Let's say you're scrolling Instagram or TikTok and you see this influencer saying, hey, I look amazing. And if you want to look amazing too, I'm just thinking of one of them saying that. If you want to look amazing like me, you should adopt my 22-step skincare routine. And if you're like me, you're going to think 22 steps? I don't have time for that. I don't have energy for that. Also, 22 steps means 22 products. That's going to cost money. So I'm probably going to skip that and say, I don't care how good you look, I'm not doing it. But if I'm scrolling and I see someone who looks amazing and they say, you can look as amazing as me, just adopt my three-step skincare routine, I'm going to be more likely to stick around and I might even try that routine because, all right, three steps, I can handle that. Now, linked on this slide that you don't have to watch, but you can if you want, Benedict worked with other social scientists to make a pamphlet geared towards American troops during World War II. And it was basically a don't be ethnocentric pamphlet where realistically, when we got involved in the war, we were sending a lot of men and women, but mostly men, from all over the country, and a lot of them from small towns. So they lived only in their communities. And now we're suddenly thrusting them into German or French or Japanese culture. And it was a lot of culture shock. So that pamphlet was basically made to kind of give them a heads up of this is what you can expect. This is what's going to be different. It's going to be okay. And that what's linked at the bottom of this slide is it was then in the 50s turned into a cartoon, which again, it's a product of its time. So it's from the 50s. Is it super advanced and progressive for 2026? No, it's a little outdated. But for, I want to say like 1956, yeah, it's pretty progressive. So it was an attempt to kind of take anthropology and bring it to a wider audience. And here's Margaret Mead with tied to the interview that I make you watch. She also tied into configurationalism and looking at the view of culture as integrated and patterned. She studied teenage and women's lives, mostly in the Pacific Islands. One of her most famous writings was Coming of Age in Samoa, published in 1928. Now, here's where we're starting to get a little more diversity. We're having some women. And one of the reason why that was very helpful is she talked to teenage girls. And she talked to them about teenage girl problems like puberty and getting your period and boys. And imagine if you're a girl, imagine when you were that age. It would already be weird if some random mid-20s white lady came up to start grilling you about that. You would already be a little closed off. But you might get to trust her a little bit through conversation. You'd probably be even more closed off if that person was a man. So, this is where I say I'm glad we started to see some diversity because even though Franz Boas was an amazing anthropologist, I don't know if he would have gotten as much information from teenage girls as Margaret Mead, who was a young woman at the time, or younger. What's also great about that book, Coming of Age in Samoa, is it was written not only for academics, it was also written for the average person to understand. And it helped a lot of people kind of understand what anthropology is and what it could be, and to really get a glimpse of a snippet of life from the other side of the world. She helped us understand culture as a force that created almost endless possibilities. We're going to jump ahead a little bit. We actually have a picture in color. Cultural materialism. This is the idea that cultural infrastructure determines structure and superstructure. Okay, I'm going through this, and as I'm looking at this, because I'm looking at the time, I'm going to introduce you to this guy, but then we're not going to cover the rest of it. This is Marvin Harris. He was from 1927 to 2001 in the US, and he thought society could be broken into three parts. Basically, he thought we could break it down into like a hierarchy or a pyramid, where you built from the bottom with technology and economics. From that, you built into kinship and descent and consumption. And then from that, you could develop religion and ideology. So it's similar kind of concept to like needs functionalism, this idea that we have universal biological needs that have to be met first, and then from there we can build onward into things like religion or ideology. So I'm going to kind of skip over that a little bit. I'm sorry to go quickly on it, but don't panic about memorizing Marvin Harris as much. Not that he wasn't important. No disrespect to the late Marvin Harris. But I do want to introduce Leslie White. He lived from 1900 to 1975, and he was a United States citizen. He wanted to change things up. He did not like that Franz Boas put all four subfields together. But unlike the Brits who want to take archaeology out, he wanted to take cultural anthropology out. He wanted to make us be a standalone discipline called culturology. Now, it didn't take off. Otherwise, you would have signed up for a culturology class. So obviously, it didn't take off. But one of the things I really liked about him is he argued against the great man theory, basically saying the great man theory says there are great humans out there in the world that have given us inventions, enlightenment, religion, scholarship. And the idea of the great man theory is that they were going to be amazing no matter what. So, somebody like Da Vinci or Einstein, you could pluck from their respected timelines and countries, stick them anywhere in the past or future, anywhere in the world, and they would still be as important to our society. He argued no, that the time has to be right and the culture has to be right. The reason why these big names are well known is because they were in the right place at the right time and they had the opportunity. Basically, what he's arguing is kind of what I was getting at with needs functionalism is if you are as genius as Einstein, and in fact, there are probably tons of Einstein level geniuses out there right now. that we unfortunately will never hear from because they're in the middle of a war-torn country, trying to find food, trying to find shelter, trying to just survive. They're not going to be sitting down and solving physics because they're too focused on survival. And so he said the reason why we have these great men is because the timing was right and their culture was right. And some of them became great because they left their culture of birth because it wasn't right. And they got somewhere safer where they could then explore the arts or science or something like that. And I personally agree with that. I think, unfortunately, there probably are a bunch of really smart people that we're never going to hear from, and probably historically a bunch of smart people that we didn't hear from. Um, yeah, which is unfortunate. But, like I said, if you're too focused on survival, you're not going to be thinking about inventions, unless that invention is going to keep you alive. Now, tied into cultural determinism, we have A.L. Kroeber. And he's important, but I'm actually going to introduce you to someone he introduces us to, who's a little, I would argue, maybe more important. Kroeber focused on the superorganic, the special domain of culture beyond the organic and inorganic realms. He argued that culture is just as important as biology. And as important as that teaching is, his research originally was studying fashion and women's hemlines. And he lived from 1876 to 1960, which is important because women's hemlines changed a lot in that time frame. When he was a kid, we would have been looking at Victorian and Edwardian era where the hemlines were all the way to the ground, not even allowed to show an ankle. And then he would have witnessed flappers from the 1920s who were showing off their knees. How risque. And I don't mean this in a creepy way, but I think he missed the invention of the miniskirt by a couple years. And I'm kind of bummed for him because I don't mean it like like I said, in a creepy way, but rather that if he was studying women's hemlines, that would have blown his mind. To see a miniskirt, he would have lost it. He would have been like, this is so different from 1876. Now, where I say yes, he's important, but who he introduces us to helped us maybe more in anthropology. The man on the right is named Ishi, Ishi. That term means man in the Yana language. He was a member, the last surviving member of the Yahi people. Back in 1911 in Northern California, he was found in the city, um, tattered clothing, I don't think any shoes, malnourished, not speaking any English, and just kind of looking for food and shelter. A.L. Kroeber and some other scientists took him in, started to kind of speak a little bit of Yana that they knew, try to teach him a little English, and figure out who this guy was. Basically, his wife and family, they were the last surviving people from a genocide and forced relocation. All their people had left or been killed. And eventually, his wife and I think child passed away due to disease. This left him with literally no one, so he kind of wandered into town. He ended up getting a job as a janitor on campus, gave him a small apartment, and he worked closely with A.L. Kroeber and others to basically try and record as much about his language and culture as they could because they were recognizing that everybody else was gone. Now, is that a little late in the game to try and help? Yes. Ideally, it would have been better if they'd try to help before they were wiped out, but he at least recognized the importance of this man. Now, Ishii did not live for very much longer, I think only a year or so. He also succumbed to disease, but he gave us a lot of really great information. And what's heartbreaking is the reason why they named him Ishii is in the Yahi people. So I want to make sure I had it right. In the Yahi custom, you don't introduce yourself. So you have to have someone else introduce you. So if we met, I wouldn't say, "Hi, my name is Stephanie." I could say hi to you, but someone else would have to say, "This is Stephanie," or "We call her Stephanie." And so when they were able to communicate with him and ask him his name, he said, "I have none because there were no people to name me." And so it is very heartbreaking, but it's the reality of the situation of what was going on in the 1800s, and before, of the treatment of Native Americans. And so I am grateful that at least we were able to meet this man and get to know some of his customs and language and traditions before he was lost. And there are probably still people surviving today with ancestry from these people, but they were forced to relocate, they were forced to assimilate, and kind of lost the culture. How much time do I have? Not a lot, not a lot. We're probably not going to finish everything, but that's okay. So, the study of symbolic anthropology. It's looking at symbols in their social and cultural context. So, looking at like the stop sign and how other countries have adopted it because it's become such a universal symbol for stopping, for stopping. Mary Douglas pictured on the screen. She's the two I have listed are from the UK, but she looks like a sweet lady. She helped tie in anthropology to other fields and really helped modern anthropologists become interdisciplinary. So, like my research, yes, I used the four subfields of anthropology to look at truckers, but I also used research from gender studies. I used research from labor studies. I used research from sociology, like all around the globe. Whatever I could get my hands on, I was going to use. And it's really because of people like Mary Douglas that told us, it's okay to branch out. If your discipline doesn't have the research, find who does and partner with them and then work on it together. And Victor Turner, I used him a lot in my research. He focused heavily on performance theory, which is tied usually to like theater, but basically it's the idea that all of us perform a little bit. So we all, every day, get up and decide how we want to present ourselves. And sometimes that is, I want to present myself very professionally. Sometimes I want to say, okay, I want to be a A plus professor, and I'm going to wear a blazer, and I'm going to my cat is so graceful. I'm trying to get the cat so I can show you at the very end. But I want to be super duper professional. And then there are days like today where I woke up and they canceled my 8 a.m. class because of the weather. And as I looked at the weather, I thought, ugh, I don't want to go out there. And I don't think my students want to go out there. So I decided to do a Zoom class, and I'm going to be really upfront with you. I did my hair and makeup. I put on, it's a graphic tee, but a nice sweater. I'm wearing leggings. I am not professional from the waist down because I knew it didn't matter as much. Now, speaking of professional, if you'll turn your attention to the camera, there is a very cute little man who is trying to figure out where the treats are. But there's the kitty cat, so you can say hi to the TA. That is all I have for today. I will end here because we're a minute away from ending time, anyways. Hopefully, I will see you in person next week. I plan on being there, so hopefully the weather will cooperate. Thank you for doing Zoom class with me. Benny says hello, and where are the treats? Stay warm and safe, and I will see you hopefully in person next week. Yes, go, be free. You are free to go. Thank you all. let you go. Come get your treat.
Thank you.
Thank you.